one amazing speaker is coming up. He's a psychologist and a software engineer as well. He's known as a forensic code expert. He's also recognized in the IT world as one of the most significant contributors to the better understanding the evolution of code in the last 10 years. Round of applause for Mr. Adam Tornhill, who's going to talk to us about software evolution, a crystal ball to prioritize technical debt. Mr. Adam Tornhill.
Good morning and welcome everyone to the software revolution. In this session, we're going to use software evolution as our crystal ball to not only identify, but also to prioritize technical debt. So let's jump right in and see what this is all about. My starting point is Martin Fowler's well-known definition of technical debt. And we're all familiar with this, so I want us to focus on the key aspect here. And the key aspect is that technical debt, just like its financial counterpart, incurs interest payments. And this is something that I've found that we in the industry, we tend to misunderstand and sometimes misuse it. And the consequence is that technical debt, the concept, is not as useful or helpful as it could be. Let me explain why. And the way I want to explain it is by doing a small experiment. So what's going to happen now is that I'm going to put up a piece of code here, and your task is to judge the quality of that piece of code. Ready? Here we go. Now quick, how many of you think this is excellent code? Not so many. One. How many would let this through in a code review? Just me. Wow. Of course, this is bad code. We don't want that kind of code. And we would never write code like that ourselves. Never ever, right? But is it a problem? Is it technical debt? Without more context, we just cannot tell. This is not technical debt unless we have to pay an interest rate on it. An interest rate, interestingly enough, is a function of time. So that means in order to uncover technical debt, we will need to put a time dimension onto our code. Where can we get such a thing? In a few minutes, I'm going to show you a technique that helps us. But before we go there, I would like to share a little story with you. So, as part of my day job, I go to different organizations and I analyze their code. And I help them prioritize and recommend improvements. And a couple of months ago, I visited this organization that prior to my arrival, they had taken a tool capable of quantifying technical debt and threw it at their code base. So they basically took this tool and threw it at their 15-year-old code base. And this tool reported that on your 15-year-old code base, you have accumulated 4,000 years of technical debt. 4,000 years. Just to put that into perspective, 4,000 years ago, that was here. That was when Moses parted the Red Sea. So my point is that 4,000 years of technical debt, it may well be accurate, but it's not particularly useful. I mean, where do you start? And does it all really matter? And in fact, I also think it's a mistake to quantify technical debt from code alone, because most technical debt isn't even technical. And this is something that I see over and over again, that we developers, we tend to mistake organizational problems for technical issues. And the consequence is that we start to address symptoms instead of the true disease. So just to give you an example, perhaps you have heard this when you come into a new project or a new organization, that this code over here, it's really, really, really hard to understand. Or maybe you have heard that, you know, the code over here, it's so buggy, it's so low quality. As we will see later today, there may be an organizational side to that as well. And then, of course, we have my personal favorite. This is something that you can see in a lot of organizations today. We have problems merging our different feature branches. We have to buy better merge tools. Again, there may be an organizational explanation for that we're going to uncover later. And I think that the main reason that we keep making these misattributions is because the organization that designs the system is invisible in the code itself. And this is unfortunate because there is a strong link between technical debt and organization. And we cannot address technical debt unless we take a holistic view of it. And that holistic view has to include a social view of our code base. So, based upon what I've told you so far, I put together a wish list. A wish list on the ideal information I would like to have in order to prioritize technical debt. So I'm going to show that list to you, and let's see if you agree with me. So the first thing I would like to know is, where's the code with the highest interest rate? The second thing I would like to know is, on an architectural level, does our architecture support the way our system evolves? Are we working with or against our architecture? And the third, and perhaps most important thing is, from an organizational perspective, are there any productivity bottlenecks in the code for inter-team coordination? You know, those parts of the code where 5 different teams need to coordinate their work all the time. Now, before I move on, by show of hands, think on the project you work on right now. And let's say you could get this information. How many of you think that some of this information could help you in your day job? Oh, like half of you. That's pretty good. Perfect. So I hope I'll be able to convince the rest of you during the rest of the session. So what I want to point out is that none of this information is available in the code itself. So how can we get that kind of information? I've pointed out that we lack 2 critical pieces of information. First of all, we would need a time dimension in order to reason about interest rates, and second, we would need a social, organizational view of our code base. How can we get that information? Where's our crystal ball? It turns out you all already have one. We're just not used to think about it that way. I'm talking about this, our version control system. Our version control system is an informational goldmine. And just to give you a quick example, this is an example from Git here. If you look at that information, you see that when we look at version control data, we get a time dimension, because we know exactly when each change to the system took place. And we can use that information to calculate a lot of interesting statistics and frequencies. We also get, even more important, we get social information, because our version control system knows exactly which programmer that did what change, and at what point in time. So let's embrace version control data, and let's see how it helps us identify code with the highest interest rate. Now, to find code with the highest interest rate, the technique I use is something called a hotspot analysis. Here's what it looks like. So this is a hotspot analysis of a well-known, mature Java code base. This is Tomcat. Has anyone worked with Tomcat? Yeah, so lots of you. Perfect. So just to walk you through how this visualization works, have a look at those large blue circles, the ones that blink on screen here. Each one of those circles represents a folder. And you see other smaller blue folders inside them. These are subfolders. So this is a hierarchical visualization that follows the folder structure of your code. It's also an interactive visualization, so we can zoom in on any area of interest here. And when we do that, we see that each file in the code base is visualized as a circle. And you see that the circles have different size. That's because size is used to represent code complexity. Now, how do you measure such a thing as code complexity? Well, we have a bunch of different metrics to choose from in the software industry. For example, cyclomatic complexity. We also have things like Halstead's volume metrics, and several others. And what they all have in common is that they're equally bad. So you can basically pick any metric that you want, and that means I tend to recommend the simplest thing that could possibly work, which turns out to be the number of lines of code. And if you look at the research, you will see that the number of lines of code has just as good predictive value for code complexity as more elaborate metrics. So let's go with the number of lines of code here. However, I just told you earlier today that just because some code is complex doesn't mean it's a problem. It's only a problem when we have to deal with it. So we need to find out, do we actually have to work in that part of the code or not? And this is data that we pull out of our version control system. So we calculate the change frequency of each file in the system and use colors to visualize it. And the interesting thing is when we combine these two dimensions, because now we're able to identify complicated code that we have to work with often. And that's our hotspots. All right, let's return to Tomcat and our hotspot analysis. You see here, even in the highest level view, we're able to identify a number of different clusters of hotspots. And we see that the hotspots, they represent relatively few areas of the total code base. So these hotspots is the code that requires most of your effort, because that's where you spend most of your development activity. And that means that's the code that you want to keep as clean as possible, as easy as maintain as possible, as easy to evolve as possible. However, in practice, more often than not, the opposite is true. And that tends to make hotspots really, really good refactoring candidates. And there's a fascinating reason why that works so well. So let me show you that reason. That reason hotspot works is because while all code is equal, some code is more equal than others. Let me show you what I mean with that statement. Please have a look at the following graphs here. All of these graphs show exactly the same thing. On the x-axis, you have each file in the system, and they are sorted according to the change frequency. That is how often you do a commit that touches that particular file. And the number of commits is what you see on the y-axis. Now, look at the 3 examples here. There are 3 examples from radically different systems, developed by different organizations, different programming languages, different domains, different lifetime spans. Everything's different. And yet, do you see any similarities? That's right. They all show exactly the same pattern. They show a power law distribution. And this, my friends, is something that I've found in every single code base that I've analyzed. This seems to be the way software evolves. And this is important because it gives us a tool to prioritize. Because what this means is that most of our code is here. It's in the long tail, which means it's rarely, if ever, touched. So if we want to do improvements, we focus our improvements here, to the relatively small part where we do most of our work. That's where the big payoff is. So hotspots are a really good starting point to identify code with the highest interest rates. But sometimes it's not enough. Sometimes you come across really, really large hotspots. And in that case, you need to do additional work. Let me show you a case study about that. So what you see here is a hotspot analysis from Microsoft's .NET Core runtime. And when I did this analysis a couple of months ago, most of the hotspots seem to be here in this package called JIT. But the interesting thing I want us to focus on now is that you see there's some kind of satellite here of hotspot called gc.cpp. That's the .NET garbage collector. And gc.cpp may look quite innocent on this visualization, but that's just because the scale of .NET Core. .NET Core is huge. So what you see on screen is approximately 4 million lines of code. And gc.cpp is a big, big file. How big? I have no idea. So let's look it up on GitHub. Whoa. Sorry, but we can't show files that are that big right now. It turns out gc.cpp is simply too big to visualize for GitHub. So we need to look at the raw file. And when we do that, we find out that gc.cpp is a file with 37,000 lines of C++. 37,000 lines of code in a single file. Let me tell you, I used to be a C++ developer. I did C++ for 10 years. And yeah, I know that's 10 years I'll never get back. But still, to me, 37,000 lines of C++ in a single file, that's really, really scary. And besides, how useful would it be if I came to your organization and told you that, hey, I found most of your maintenance problems, you just need to rewrite gc.cpp and everything will be fine. Again, it would be accurate, but it's not particularly helpful. I mean, where do you start? So, the key is you need information that you can act upon. And knowing that gc.cpp is a hotspot, how do you react on that information? The answer is you don't. So you need much more details. So what I suggest is this. Once we identify those large hotspots, what we do is that we run the same analysis, but now on a function level. So we basically parse the code and calculate hotspots based on which functions that are changed over time. Let me show you what that looks like for gc.cpp. So it turns out the hotspots in this case are now functions. And it turns out the number one hotspot here is a function called grow brick card tables. It's a pretty big function consisting of 332 lines of code. But that's still much less than 37,000 lines of code, which was the size of the total file. And it's definitely less than 4 million lines of code, which was the size of the total system. And even more important, we are now at a level where we can act upon the information. Because this is data that you can actually give to a single developer, and they could do a focused refactoring task, and it would take them a couple of days, and you would actually get a real improvement based on data from how you, as an organization, have worked with the code so far. All right, so we're going to return to our hotspots in a while. But first, I want to uncover how do you get to a file with 37,000 lines of code? You see, I just can't let that go. So what you see here is one of the best books I know on how organizations fail. This book is called The Challenge or Launch Decision, and it's written by Diane Vaughan. So how many of you remember the Challenger accident back in the 1980s? So some of you. So let's do a quick recap here on what happened. So this is the Challenger at its final launch. And if you look closely here, you will be able to see a puff of gray smoke here. You see that? Not a good thing. It's not supposed to be there. So what happened here was that this object that you see is called a solid rocket booster. These are huge rockets, right? And they are delivered in 3 separate segments that are then assembled. And it turned out what happened here was that one of the joints in the solid rocket booster leaked, and hot rocket gases were able to escape and compromise the structure. And the result was a complete disaster and a tragic loss of human lives. Now, what Diane Vaughan does in her book is that she uses the Challenger accident as a case study. Because it turns out, those solid rocket booster joints, back in the 1970s, where the Challenger was designed, the early testing showed that the actual performance of the solid rocket booster joints deviated from the predicted performance. Now, what do you do in that situation? That's right, you form a committee. So they did. And that committee discussed the problem and passed it off as an acceptable risk. Years later, the first in-flight tests showed that, again, the real performance of the solid rocket booster joints deviated from the predicted performance. Again, it was discussed and passed off as an acceptable risk. And it went on and on like that for a couple of years before, on the very eve of the launch, there were some concern raised about the solid rocket booster joints due to the cold temperatures in Florida at that time. Again, the problem was discussed and passed off as an acceptable risk. And the result was the death of us astronauts. And this is what Diane Vaughan calls the normalization of deviance. And what she means by that is that each time that you make a trade-off and you accept a risk, you get a new point of reference. The deviations become your new normal. And the reason I like this theory is because it's not about spaceships. It's about people. And that means we have a lot of normalization of deviance in software development too. So let's say, for example, that you inherit a file with 6,000 lines of code. If you work long enough with that file, soon those 6,000 lines will become your new normal. And besides, what difference does a few extra 100 lines of code do? So soon you have 7,000, then you have 8,000, and so on. And we need to find a way to fight and stop the normalization of deviance. And this is one of the best techniques I know for doing that. This is something I call complexity trends. Here's how it works. So what I do now is that each time we have a hotspot, we go to the version control history and we pull out each historic revision of that hotspot, and then we measure the complexity at each point in time, which allows us to plot a trend like this. So you see two lines here. The blue line shows the growth and accumulation of lines of code. And we see that this particular hotspot keeps growing in size, which is often a problem in itself. But that problem's even more serious when you see that the code complexity, that is, how hard is this code for a human to understand, grows at an even more rapid rate. This is a huge, huge warning sign. So with complexity trends, we can basically trace and supervise the evolution of a particular hotspot. So we can see in this particular example, back in 2016, there was some refactoring done here, which reduced the complexity, but it probably failed to address the root cause. So soon the complexity kept creeping in before we hit this steep increase, which is a gigantic warning sign. The normalization of deviance is one of the reasons why whistleblowers are so important in organizations. And I found that complexity trends make great whistleblowers in code. So to sum this up, we've seen how hotspots help us find the code with the highest interest rate. And we learned that the reason hotspots work is because all code isn't equal. And finally, we saw how complexity trends can act as whistleblowers that help us fight the normalization of deviance. What I want to do now is I want to climb up the abstraction ladder and reason about how these techniques help us evaluate our architectural patterns and actually supervise how our systems evolve. And you cannot really talk about software architecture without mentioning art. So what you see here is something called a liquid crystal light projection. It's done by the artist Gustav Metzger. And I visited Tate Modern in London last year, where I watched this exhibition. And this is so fascinating. If you stand and watch his projections, you will see that they change all the time. So this artwork looks different today than it did yesterday. And the interesting thing is the way it changes. Because the way it changes is that it necessitates the destruction of an existing form for the creation of a new form. And this is exactly how software is supposed to evolve. It's also a reason I like hotspots, because hotspots make it clear that the code base is never done. Successful code will evolve, and that's a good thing. The reason I say code is auto-destructive is that most systems, they just hit a point where they become more and more complicated, and at some time they reach a tipping point. And beyond that point, they get ridiculously expensive to maintain. So how can we detect that tipping point? What I suggest is this. Just as we saw that we can calculate complexity trends for individual files, what we do here is that we take the complexity trends of all files in the system and we aggregate it to get a complexity trend of the whole system. And this data may help us identify and possibly predict when we reach that tipping point. And that tipping point is a sign that we need to take a step back and start to actively invest in improvements to our code. Now, where would those improvements be? Well, we learned about hotspots, which may help us identify individual files. But on this level, we want our information to to match our architecture, we need higher level information. So what I suggest is the following. What we do now is that we take a group of individual files and we aggregate the contributions to all those files and name it using a logical name. And we basically map individual files and folders to logical components. And you can use a mapping that follows your folder structure. The most important thing is that whatever grouping you choose, it should carry architectural significance in your context. Once we do that, we can start to get a lot of interesting questions because we can start to reason about how a system evolves on an architectural level. Let me show you an example on a service-oriented architecture. So, what I would do now, when I do an analysis on architectural level, is that I would take all files belonging to each service here and group them into logical components, aggregate all contributions and calculate hotspots on that level. And once we do that, we can get answers to one of the big questions we have in our industry around microservices. And this is a question where a lot of flame wars have been fought. Friendships have been ended. And the question is, how big is a microservice supposed to be? 100 lines of code, 500, 1,000? We all know it's pointless to reason about it in terms of lines of code. What we're after here is behavior. We want each service to implement a single business capability, right? So let's see how hotspots help us out there. So we calculate hotspots on the level of service. And here's an example from our real-world system. We see that the number one hotspot on an architectural level is a service called recommendations. And just as we did a complexity trend on a system level, we can also aggregate the complexity trend for this individual service and look at its evolution. So we see that the recommendation service evolved quite rapidly, and now it seems to have stabilized on a fairly high level, where it consists of around 5,000 lines of code. Now, how do you use this information? You use this information to ask the right questions. And that question in this case is, does this recommendation service, our hotspot with 5,000 lines of code, really implement a single business capability? So you use this information to identify services that are perhaps better off split into multiple services, which will benefit the overall cohesion of the system. But you can do even more with this information. And I would like to show you how by introducing you to a concept called temporal coupling. Here's how it works. Consider this simple system consisting of just 3 different modules. Now, the first time you do a change to the system, you modify the fuel injector and diagnostics module together. The second time you do a change, you modify something else. And the third time, you're back to modifying the fuel injector and diagnostics module together. Now, if this is a trend that continues, there has to be some kind of relationship between the fuel injector and diagnostics module, right? Because they keep changing together over time. Let's see how we can use this kind of insight to gain information about our architectural patterns and how well they support the way we work with the code. And I would like to give you some examples from different architectures. And I would like to start with the layered architecture. And the reason I would like to start with layers is because it's still so popular. And when you go to an organization that claims to do layered architecture, most of the time, they show you something like this. Some variation on the model view controller pattern, right? It may be a model view presenter, model view model, doesn't really matter. Something like this. What's important, though, is that this is never, ever what the layered architecture looks like in practice. Because we all know we also must have a services layer. And we also know that we need a repository layer. And the reason we need a repository layer is because I actually don't know, so let's call it a best practice. And below that, we want the object relational mapper and then maybe some SQL, and in practice, you often have even more layers. Now, when I analyze layered architecture with temporal coupling, what I do is this. I group all files belonging to each layer into a logical component, so I can calculate my coupling on the boundaries of layers. And when you do that in a layered architecture, you will see that the majority of your change coupling goes like this. In fact, I've found that in a layered architecture, somewhere between 30 to 70% of all commits ripple through your architecture. And this has important implications, because the original idea with layer is that they give us a sense of structure, a separation of concerns. But if every change affects multiple layers, we lose the benefit of separations. We're actually working against the architecture, and the reason that may be a problem is because in a layered architecture, few changes are local, right? The majority of them affect multiple layers. And this works well as long as you have a really small and focused team. Now, when your product becomes a success, you need to scale up, you want to do more features, you want to add more people to it. And the moment you do that, you are quite likely to run into problems with layered architectures, because now you have lots of people working the same parts of the code, which quite a lot increases the risk for conflicting changes and unexpected feature interactions, which we're going to talk a little bit more about soon. So I think one of the drawbacks here with layered architecture is what led to the recent hype and popularity of microservice architectures. And like we all know, this is exactly what microservices look like in PowerPoint. In reality, we know that they tend to be much more complex. We may have shared building blocks, we may have service templates, client APIs, cross-cutting concerns like diagnostics and monitoring, right? So what I do with microservices is that one of the key principles between a successful microservice architectures is loose coupling. Because the moment you start to couple different services to each other, you lose most of the benefits of a microservice architecture, and you are left with an excess mess of complexity. So if we have a fundamental, important design principle like that, why don't we supervise it? And we can supervise it using temporal coupling. So again, we group everything belonging to a single service into a logical component, and now we can measure temporal coupling, and in this case, we want to watch out for change patterns like this. Patterns that ripple across service boundaries. And used that way, temporal coupling may work as a safety net, as an early warning system that points you to potential problems before they become huge issues. And if you use it that way, that may help you to prevent what I call the microservices shotgun surgery pattern. Now, what is this shotgun surgery pattern? In a microservice world, it's basically when you want to tweak a single business capability and you end up modifying 5 different services. And the main reasons I've seen that happen is because, first of all, the services may share code that itself isn't stable from an evolutionary perspective. The second main reason I've seen is that some services are just implemented as leaky abstractions. So they expose a lot of implementation details that different services depend upon. And finally, there's a social side too, because this is something, sorry. I'm censoring myself here. All right, perfect. Can you hear me well? Great. So this is something I've seen happen more frequently when the same team is responsible for the same services within a same domain. So, what tools do I use to do this analysis? This is still a young field, so the tooling options are quite limited. In fact, when I wrote my book, Your Code is a Crime Scene, a couple of years ago, there was no tool available that could do the analysis I wanted to do. So I put together my own open source tool, a simple proof of concept. It's available on my GitHub, so you can look it up if you want to play around with these techniques. It's a pretty good starting point just to get some experience with them. However, what I've been working on since then is something called CodeScene. So CodeScene is a tool that's able to automate all this analysis. So it's basically you point codes into your code base, press a button, and get all the analysis results. So it's a work in progress, so if you enjoy this analysis, please consider to have a look at CodeScene and support it. Now, there are also some interesting tools in the academic field. And my personal favorite has to be the evolution radar, which is particularly strong when it comes to temporary coupling. Finally, if you want to build your own tools, I recommend you have a look at the Moose platform. The Moose platform is a great framework for building code analysis tool. It's also a perfect excuse to learn to program in Smalltalk. It's a great language, by the way. So, to sum up this architectural section, we have seen that hotspots not only work on a file and function level, that they also scale up to help us detect architectural hotspots. And we've seen the same thing is true with complexity trends. They may help us identify our system's tipping point. And finally, we learned how we can use temporary coupling to evaluate the way we actually work with the architecture. Now, I want to spend the final minutes in this presentation by exploring the social side of our code base. And before I do that, I would like to ask you, how many of you develop software as part of a team? So that's almost everyone. Good. So, yeah, we have to do that because we need to take on larger and larger problems, and we need to put together a team to be able to address that because the problem is too big for a single individual. However, what I want us to be aware of, and this is really critical, is that teamwork always comes at a cost. And that cost is something called process loss. And process loss is a concept from social psychology. And the social psychologists, in turn, have borrowed the concept from the field of mechanics. So the idea is that just like a machine cannot operate at 100% efficiency all the time due to things like friction and heat loss, neither can a team. And here's the model of it. So let's say we have a number of individuals. Put together, they have a potential productivity here. However, that's never, ever what you get out of it. The real productivity is always smaller, and part of the potential is simply lost. And again, this kind of process loss depends upon the task, but in software, most of the process loss revolves around soft issues like communication, coordination, motivation. And the bad news are that we can never eliminate process loss entirely. The trick is to minimize it. And one of the common reasons for process loss is something called the diffusion of responsibility, which is yet another theory from social psychology. And now I want to warn you here, because I'm going to talk about a really, really controversial topic. Yeah, I'm going to go out on deep water here. I'm going to do something absolutely crazy, something you never do. I'm going to talk about code ownership. And I do that because I want to point out, when I say code ownership, I don't mean ownership in the sense of, hey, this is my code, stay away. No, not at all. I mean code ownership in the sense that someone takes a personal responsibility for the quality and the future of a piece of code. And that someone could be an individual, or it could be a small team in a larger organization. So, the diffusion of responsibility is something that you can see if you're unfortunate enough to witness an accident or an emergency. Because what happens in that case is that it turns out that the larger the group of bystanders, the more people present, the less likely an individual will offer help. This is actually quite a scary thing. And I think it's exactly the same in software. We must feel that our individual contributions make a difference. And good code means code where we have a sense of personal responsibility from everyone involved. And there's really no way around it. So again, when we have an important principle, we need to measure it. How can we measure stuff like that, like coordination? It's invisible in our code. Remember, we're in version-controlled wonderland. So we know exactly which programmer that worked with which part of the code. All we need to do now is to aggregate the contributions from the people on the same team as defined by the organization. And that let us present a map like this that shows the inter-team coordination needs. So this is an analysis that's based on a research paper that I reference here. The general idea is that the more teams that have to work on a part of the code, the more red that module. And this is not just about the number of teams, it's also how fragmented their development efforts are, because the more fragmented, the likely it is that the coordination need will be higher. So this is important to identify for several reasons. First of all, coordination itself leads to process loss, which we want to minimize. And second, there's also a quality aspect. Because it's a well-researched topic, and it turns out that the number of people working on a piece of code is one of the best predictors on the number of defects you will find. So the more people contribute into a piece of code, the higher the risk for defects. So it's really important to identify those areas where you have diffusion of responsibility. And once you identify them, there's usually no easy fix. But there are two things I've seen work in practice. The first is to inspect the code from a technical point of view. And the reason I want to do that is because the reason a piece of code attracts many different teams is probably because it has many reasons to do so. It has too many responsibilities. So identifying those responsibilities and separating the code based on responsibilities will not only make your system more cohesive, it will also help you minimize the coordination needs between different teams. And sometimes it's also necessary for an organization to introduce a new team to take on a shared responsibility. And this is something I see happen in areas like this called integration tests. Integration tests tend to be a collaborative effort. And I'm pretty sure that you actually need someone who takes the responsibility of that piece of code to guarantee that it doesn't degrade into hotspots and code with high diffusion of responsibilities. So we can do even more with this data. We can actually use it to visualize exactly how the different teams work in the code base, which allows us to measure things like Conway's law. Here's an example. Now, it's the same kind of visualization, but now each color represents the work of a different team. And we can see that in this particular architecture, it's a package by feature architecture, we see that with respect to Conway, this looks wonderful, right? Each team pretty much have their own feature they can work on. So this is a minimum of coordination needs here. This is wonderful. However, I have to make a small confession here. All visualizations, all data that you've seen so far are from real-world systems, except this one. I had to make it up, because I'm yet to find an organization that's that well aligned with their code. So what I tend to find most of the time looks much more like this, which, by the way, is from a real-world code base. So this is an organization that decided to move to feature teams. So the way they did it was basically they took their organization and sliced them into 12 different feature teams. And this is what the resulting contributor patterns look like. And you have to look really, really hard to see some kind of pattern here. I mean, sure, if you look really carefully, you may see one or two areas where one team dominates a little bit, but in general, this is true collective chaos. This is basically a system where 12 different teams make changes to the same code all the time for different reasons, since they work on different stories. Not only does this put you at risk for defects due to unexpected feature interactions, you also pay a huge price for the necessary communication and process overhead you need in order to coordinate that. Further, you also miss synergies between different features, that is, simplifications to the problem domain. So one of my most important recommendations to you today is please align your architecture and your organization. Your code is going to thank you for it. So I'm almost done now, and I hope you enjoyed this journey through the fascinating field of evolving code. Ultimately, it's all about writing better software. Software is able to evolve with the pressure of new features, novel usages, and changed circumstances. And writing code of that quality will never, ever be easy. So we need all the support we can get. And I hope that this presentation has inspired you to inspect the field in much more detail. And to help you get started, I put together a number of references here. I will post my slides later too. But if you want to dive deeper into this, I have my book, Your Code is a Crime Scene, available in most online bookstores. I also blog a lot about this at mpere.com, where I present different case studies of open source projects. And of course, we have CodeScene itself if you want to play around with the analysis on your own code. Now, I will spend some time on the dev stage taking questions, but before I do that, I would like to ask the technicians to post the questions to you, so you can use the voting app for that. Let's see. I'm really excited to see if it works now. Yeah. So what information would be most useful in a current project? Oh, votes are coming in. Really cool. Wow. Yeah, please keep voting. And I just want to tell that this is something I want to address these results at the dev stage, and I hope we can get into some interesting discussions around this. Before I go there, I also want to take this opportunity and say thanks a lot for listening to me, and may the code be with you. Thanks.
Thank you, Adam. That was a great presentation.